please welcome on stage the co-director of the festival, Monica. I don't know if you're here. Monica and Linda. Ah, yeah, here you are. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Thank you.
So obviously, my first question is, how do you feel?
Yeah, a little bit relieved, actually. It was such a long process to make this film, at least 4 years of work. And then see it on the big screen, of course, it's very exciting. And we are very happy, of course, that we could present it here at this festival. I think it fits very well here. Yes, so Linda, how do you feel?
Yeah, also relieved and yeah, quite amazed by the reactions here in the public, in the audience. Thank you.
So Monica Grassel and Linda Osuski, you're both filmmakers. Linda, you're also a journalist, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's the first time you're working together. Is it right?
Yes, on a big project, yes. We already worked together in other contexts for somebody, so we know each other.
And how did you come together for this project? And what was your intention at the beginning? Did you had in mind since the beginning to expose the contradiction of this Green New Deal?
Like I was in Spain visiting the supposedly poorest village, and there was a uranium mine plan that was in 2019, and I was quite struck by what a uranium mine. And then I figured out it was not only a uranium mine, it was also several lithium mines, nickel, vanadium, yeah, really strange exotic metals. And there are a lot of mining or exploration going on. And I found out that it was because of the EU Green Deal, and I found that very interesting. So I asked Monica if she wanted to join to investigate in a documentary film this topic. So.
Yeah, that's how we came together.
And you said yes instantly. You were already working on social issues, but not necessarily on these kind of topics.
Yes, because when I heard about this topic, it was like, Linda was like, what? Mining in Europe? It's so far away. It is from the past, something from the past. And then so many, as I started to read, there were so many. That was what really hit me. And also then I thought, it's not only worth a report, you have to see it with your own eyes, because film, the advantage with film is that you can really show what it means with visual pictures, and it's so massive and so impressive, and that's why I decided, yes, we have to do a film about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add that, like, what was also very interesting is that in Brussels it was framed in the context of the Green Deal. Now we will do green mines, sustainable mines, like they have different names for it, responsible mines, what you have. So yeah, and we found that like interesting and to check if it's really like this.
Yeah, it was. We went into this project very openly, meaning that we didn't judge before, is it possible or not. And to be honest, sometimes if you talk to the industry and the politicians, you tend to switch sides because they are so convincing, but then you have to get a step backwards or meet the people on the ground and, of course, talk to the other side. So it was also for us like, yeah, it was a slalom, like
a journey and a process.
Like, they have arguments and they have arguments, but of course, yeah, of course, then in the end we made up our opinion about the subject.
Yeah, that's something I like to hear about. It's how you picked the protagonists that you have, and meaning both the people affected by the mining project, but also how you picked the people in Brussels and the head of companies. It's interesting the way you managed to give voice to both sides, let's say. How did you approach them? Did they had in mind did they know what you had in mind for this film? Like, how did you connect with them, and how did they accept to participate in such a project?
Like the departing point, as I said, was this village in next to the other village in Extremadura in Spain. So there are a lot of associations, citizen platforms that organize on a very local level, and there are lots of them to fight not only mines, there are also other infrastructure projects because there's a lot of corruption down there. And and we wanted to see someone who who has really something at stake, because for example Hector, who really was struggling, what shall he do? It's quite it's really bad if you see someone and you don't know if next year, in 2 years, in 3 years, and you really can't plan to the future. And we saw that also later in Sweden when we went to Sweden. Maybe why we went to Sweden is because in Brussels, the Scandinavian countries, they're always they're the how to say, the good
best examples.
Yeah, the best example. Thank you. The best example, and they do it good and well, and and so we wanted to see that. We already did research online, but then we saw also that there's the Sami community. Many people don't even know that there is an indigenous people in Europe. It's the only indigenous group in Europe, and many people in Europe don't know that. So that's also interesting. And so then we went to Sweden also with the aim to see the mines and the companies, but also the Sami and their relationship.
Also their relationship to nature. So we wanted to have people who are already having this sustainability, this sustainable way of life. This was important for us, from the south and the north. That was the idea behind.
And what about the people from the companies and the EU institution? Were they hard to convince to take part of the film, or were they happy to share their excellent example of best mines, green mines and stuff?
I think they are proud about their narrative. So they have their narrative, and they will tell you that, and they will tell you the same on conferences. And of course, we met them on conferences and the parliament. So I don't think they were, I think they were happy to talk.
Yeah, but that was also interesting. They were happy to talk in this Brussels context, but when you then ask, can I see your mine, or can you show me something, then it's a bit harder to get into touch. So mostly it's the lobby representatives that are very, it's very sympathetic people, and they really are seem open and etc. But then if you really want to access and visit the mine, it's more complicated. Like for example, with LKAB, we already had scheduled a visit, the first one. And half an hour before that, I mean, we went all the way up to Kiruna, which is really, really far in the north. And an hour before our meeting, they almost cancelled it with some strange excuses that I don't know who was sick, and then the other one was also sick, so there is no one who can attend us. But Diego, yes, he would be attended, so it was really, because they didn't know that we went there with Diego, so that we did. So so that was a bit strange, but finally we convinced them that we have to go and see the mine. So when you really go near them, they don't like it so much. So yes.
And so, because this is the first screening of the film is going to be aired on Arte in maybe July, you said,
we don't know the exact date, but until July it should be aired on Arte, and German TV also on SWR.
Mm-hmm. With a different title, though, you said.
Yes.
But mostly the same film. What do you expect people to take out of the film, now that it's over? What's your hope for... what do you expect from the audience after watching such a film?
Yeah, I hope that the film speaks for itself. Me personally, I don't have an expectation but I do hope that there is some impact from the film, and I also that this is not a black and white thing, and then it's a very, very complex situation. That's but I hope at least that there will be a debate, and yes.
Yeah, I think we can resume it. We wanted to plant a seed for a different way of thinking and approaching economy and growth, and not always repeating the same mantra. We have to grow. Just at least start thinking differently.
Yeah, and then every technological solution has like is creating other shifting the problems, not really a solution.
Well, tonight we're going to try to make your dream come true and have a debate, I mean, at least a discussion following the film. Thank you very much. You're staying with us in the room, so if people have questions after the roundtables, they can reach out to you. You'll be outside, so don't hesitate to come over to Monica and Linda. Thank you very much. Yes?
Maybe just to... if you want to rewatch it on Arte, the title will be, like in French, it will be Les Mines Vertes. In German, for the one who speaks German, it's the Rohstoffdilemma.
Voilà. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Merci infiniment. On va voir.
Thank you so much. So we're going to have a quick switch up here on stage. We'll see a short preview, and then we'll have Paloma Moritz, who will join us and introduce the next speakers.
Bonsoir à toutes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
On va commencer tout de suite. Je vous préviens simplement du fait que
we are going to start without further ado, but as Robin said, the debate will be recorded and will be posted on the BLAST website in the coming weeks, so you will be able to share it with those of you who couldn't be here this evening. It is obvious to many of you our growth model with finite resource on a finite planet. We need to question it. However, despite all the growing crises, we are not discussing the issue. And I think we should, because it's at the very heart of the current debate. How can we respect the planetary limits while guaranteeing equity and justice? What would a redistributive economy look like? How could it respect fundamental rights for people? How can we strike a new balance together? Let's look at the various steps on the way and the various obstacles that might be encountered. That's what we will be looking into this evening. We have Olivia Lazard. You're a mediation expert, and you mostly focus on climate justice, climate transition, conflict and vulnerabilities related to climate change and biodiversity loss. Timothée Parrique, good evening. Timothée was in the documentary, as you've seen. He is a researcher in economics at the University of Lausanne. You are a specialist of the link between the environment and capitalism. And last but not least, we have Julia Steinberger. You're a researcher in ecological economy at the Lausanne University. And since 2023, you've focused on post-growth society. You're also one of the main author of the IPCC in the Working Group 3. Let's start off with a quote. It's easier to picture the end of the world than to picture the end of capitalism, as the end of the world seems maybe too close now. It might be time to start thinking about the end of capitalism. Timothée, my first question goes out to you. Where should we start? Well, we should envisage the economy as a board game. We've played a different set of games, and in the Industrial Revolution in the 17th and 18th century, there's been a change of mindset. There's been appropriation of the means of production, of equity. We've produced more money. And if we want to think post-capitalism, then we would need to change these 4 pillars. So we would envisage work not based on an employee-employee relationship, but through something else, maybe through the commons, coordination through collective management, through collective support, donations. Might not be private property of means of production that are owned by companies, but shared properties with production units with that would make limited profit. So it could be a switch from playing Monopoly. As we're playing Monopoly 24/7 today, we think that Monopoly is the economy. We could play a different game, and Monopoly would become such a small part of the economy that we would think all of this differently. We would go towards more concrete utopias, such as local currencies, local produce networks, and so on. Thank you. Julia Steinberger, there is an article that was published on Bon Pot, the website, on which you mentioned degrowth. Why is it possible to talk about these topics, to bring them back to the forefront, and how can we do that now? Well, the answer is easy. Nothing can be emancipatory or progressist if we don't focus on the planetary limits. Humanity needs to fit within those planetary limits in order to live in a stable level of prosperity. So we need to look at that, but we also need to look at what forces push us towards the accumulation of wealth, the forces that drive capitalism, as Timothée just described them. They are structural forces, but also personal forces. And that includes fossil fuel industries, large companies. We've seen the mining companies that have a very dubious relationship towards reality in the documentary. And those forces are driving us towards more unequal economies and more destructive economies. When we look at social progress, human progress, ecological progress, well, we're faced with the same obstacles. So it would be about time for us to merge our struggles and to understand that we won't have any social equity or justice that respect human rights if we don't take all of that into account. Olivia Lazard, in 2023 at the Beyond Growth Forum, you explained that your fieldwork on energy transition and at the global level that there was a lot of potential for authoritarianism, so more environmental destruction, more social violence. Could you explain that? Because in the discussions that we had before the round table, you were saying that growth plays a role in international security as well. Thank you. Well, thank you, because it allows me to put things back in context, international context, because that's the angle through which I'm looking at those things. When I spoke at the Beyond Growth conference, I discussed fieldwork I did on conflict stabilization in the Middle East and in Africa, in Central African Republic, among others. So in 2018, I was in Bangui, and that was the year where the Wagner militia arrived in the Central African Republic. So they arrived in Bangui, and then they disappeared for about 3 months. And then we found them again on specific locations that were thought to be mining locations related to diamond mining. And that's a very important economy for the Kremlin internationally. And that's also part of the illicit financial networks. Before I move on to Madagascar, a word on the Central African Republic. In the Central African Republic, gold mining tends to indicate the presence of other types of minerals, including rare earth. When I was there, they were promoting the quality of the soil, and because of course, that needed to be verified because studies were still ongoing, and they were trying to promote that in order to promote a growth economy and to get out of the conflict situation in the country. Of course, the mining economy in fragile contexts like CAR is very much related to figures in the elite. These people accumulate wealth through mining, so that's where the danger was, in my opinion. Fast forward a few years, 2021, 2022, I'm on a mission in Madagascar, specifically to try to understand the environmental destruction and social unrest related to energy transition. So what I learned in Madagascar is that Russian oligarchs have supported presidential candidates in 2017 and in the last election, including the current president of Madagascar. In exchange for their support to the candidate, the Russians managed to pass military agreements that include geological research, and they also managed to get access to a chromium mine. That chromium mine was a gateway for them to the geological market of Madagascar. And I found the same structure in different countries in Africa. And that leads us to the beginning of the war in Ukraine. At the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I was one of the first to alert on the fact that Ukraine is one of the wealthiest countries in Europe in fossil fuels, in rare earth, and in arable land. So when I spoke at Beyond Growth, I reported that on the ground, I noticed the fact that vulnerability was instrumentalized. I saw how which levers they used to play on both standards, narratives, green transition, and the defense transition. And before Donald Trump was re-elected, the message I was trying to convey was the following. beware, Europe has been asleep for too long regarding the fact that there was things happening in the international geopolitical theater, despite the fact that the world was at peace, quote unquote. And other economies were very, very active in Africa and elsewhere. And the thing is, today, there is very intense competition in the global south, in the Balkans, in Central Asia, Southeast Asia. And on all those theaters, the great powers are trying to get a part of the cake. And this is where we overshoot the planetary limits. And if we try to look one level down, if we look at international security, well, it becomes obvious that we are on geopolitical tectonic plates. And my friend Diego in the documentary was talking about Europe as an empire, but Europe has forgotten itself for a long time. Europe has become a technocracy and has been looking at raw materials and mining as a technical issue. So now we have the Raw Materials Act, which is aiming at regaining some level of control in a situation where Russia and China are trying to weaken the European peace project. Coming back to these geopolitical issues and trying to draw a link between society, national security and geopolitics, I would like to come back to something that happened in Switzerland on the 9th of February. We voted on a responsible economy that would respect planetary limits. So the idea was to respect the limits of the ecosystems and to amend the constitution. This proposal was made by the Green Party. However, it was rejected at 70%, over 70% in all the cantons of the country, and the turnout rate was 38%. The conservative parties and the federal government had campaigned against this proposal. Julia Steinberger, you're Swiss, you live in Switzerland. What would have happened if the Swiss people had voted yes to this votation?
This proposal would have changed absolutely everything. We would have changed economic system. We would have changed the way we operate. Switzerland considers itself to be a green country, a sustainable country, and yet we are actually one of the countries that most significantly exceeds the planetary limits because of our imports, because of our living standards. We would have had to change things completely. It's difficult to do that from a technical point of view. It is possible, but you have to change your economic priorities. And our consumption levels bring us a lot closer to the impact level of the United States. We criticize the US, but we're quite close to them in terms of emissions per inhabitant. But what really means that our consumption skyrockets is our economic sector in terms of the financial activities and planetary destruction. We have banks that and financial institutions that are involved in these activities, and they are extremely well informed, even better than you and me, despite me being a researcher in this field. And we have organizations too that ought to be part of public interest, like the Swiss National Bank, that invests significantly in fossil fuels and energies. And we know this. We know this thanks to the works of colleagues at the University of Lausanne, and also there's all the oil trading which takes place in Geneva. It's a huge sector in this city. We have institutions such as Trafic du Rhin and Vitol that are based here in Geneva, and we have Glencore in the Zug canton, one of the main negotiators of raw materials. So the Swiss economy is not at all neutral in terms of the destruction of the planet. It is fully involved, and this initiative would have obviously endangered its economic and political priorities. The campaign, the Jeunes Verts didn't have the necessary clout to win. It was absolutely impossible. But the very fact that the challenge was launched and that some 30% of the Swiss actually said that they were in favor of the initiative is a massive step forward. In fact, I'm quite impressed by the end result. And we have to be aware of the fact that the way communication takes place has changed a lot. Communication now is much more manipulated. We're led to believe that
le changement du monde que le changement du capitalisme.
Changing the world is almost impossible. The first campaign was Suisse sans armée, Switzerland without an army, in 1989, and we only had some 30% of people voting in favor. We were trying to get rid of the Swiss army. It was considered to be a constitutional crisis. The army actually never recovered. You're a young Swiss. You know what all of that meant. The history of Switzerland was rethought. The role of the army was diminished. And I think that here we had a score that was very similar, and we need to continue working in this way and not give up. I know that it was presented in a very negative way to the general public, but in my view, it was a victory, and we should not give up.
Timothée Parrique, vous le disiez récemment dans une interview, vous élaborez.
Timothy, you were saying recently in an interview that you were creating scenarios so that we could transition when the day comes. So how would that happen? Do we need to modify our constitution, as was the case with that proposal? What would the different stages be? Well, you need to keep in mind the fact that in the proposal there were three elements. There was working on the planetary limits, and it needed to be done in the next 10 years. And thirdly, it needed to be done in a way that was socially acceptable. Now, all of that makes the situation very complex when you want to work on scenarios of degrowth. Now, a degrowth scenario is an temporary transition in an economy which, after decades of growth, is going to find itself in a situation where its footprint is greater than its capacity, and that can't be sustainable. So it then needs to introduce a whole host of new elements, which over several years will equate to an economic downturn. So it's all a matter of looking at those 100-odd interventions that are going to allow for that downturn or slowdown of the economy. Now, you may feel that it's almost impossible because the economy grows naturally on its own, and that's not at all the case. To get an economy to grow, it's a very complex task. If you take ask an economist how you go about creating growth, and they will be incapable of telling you how it happens. And the same goes for degrowth. What we do know is that we can split it up into different sectors. So you have growth, you have firms which are going to compete. These are profit-making companies, and it's going to create a phenomena of accumulation and selection of the most lucrative firms. So it's kind of an accelerator, a little bit like consumption. You're going to have practices of programmed obsolescence. You're going to have advertising that creates consumerist and materialistic societies, which are all going to drive consumption and production and growth. So you have those imperatives of growth, and you're going to get rid of them. So if you want things to become more sober, if you want to encourage families to take the plane less often, to eat less meat, to use their cars less often, you're going to stop advertising meat, cars, and planes. It can be in your face, but it can also be very subtle, the way the firms are funded, the interest rates, for example, or how the loans are constructed. And then there's all the funding of public services. Don't forget that armies, too, are public services. So these economies can have there are the imperatives of growth that could be more or less violent, and the economy is more or less dependent on commerce. VAT is very closely linked to growth. But taxes don't all have the same links to trading and trading activities. Degrowth is more of a surgical approach to lighten the footprint of an economy. Once it's been triggered, then, and this brings me to the proposal, which I really like, the one on the economy. Markets and the capitalist economy, you remember that an economy is something with very specific rules. A capitalist can sell pretty much everything except nothing. So it's somewhat problematic to use this system to create degrowth. It's just impossible. One of its functions means that it's impossible. And therefore, you have to impose rules outside of the economy. That's why the legal modifications, be it non-proliferation treaties of fossil fuels or energies, rights in the constitution, or whatever it is that you decide on, it's going to be a extra economic rule, and you're going to reinvent the economy, which is ultimately a small administrative thing. It's not the main thing relating to our life in society, and you're going to adjust it to be able to achieve your objective. And in terms of adjustments, and we've said this already, in theory, there's nothing that can prevent it. In fact, I believe that currently it is increasingly impossible, even in theory, to imagine how we can possibly continue to feed and socially and ecologically allow for growth to continue in our countries. Now, there is something that we shouldn't lose sight of, and that's the geopolitical tensions that we're witnessing today. People starting to talk about the Third World War. Olivia, how could we possibly change the economy in a world that's in crisis as it is at the moment? Can we really conceive of an economy that takes into account both sustainability and the national and international crises that we're experiencing? The prism of planetary limits is not yet adopted in Brussels. People are aware of it, it's discussed, but it remains very much an imperative with regard to CO2 emissions. It's kind of carbon tunnel. And then the other emergency that appeared over the last 2 months is to recover competitiveness in Europe, because without competitiveness, you can't establish a balance between these international powers. You can't support the ability of the European Union to develop standards, be it in the digital field, environmental field, or anywhere where there is consumption. And the other thing that has become apparent is the fact that weapons need to be are being developed again. We know that Russia doesn't want to stop with Ukraine. Its ambitions are much more imperialistic. And there are ambitions that it has accepted, acknowledged, and spoken about openly, which is to dismantle the European Union and the system that the European Union tried to defend for a while. In addition to this, there's been a complete change of direction at the White House. So the relations between the European Union and America are turned upside down. The relationship is being dismantled a stone at a time, a day at a time. And this has led to a new program. It's only a few days old, Rearm Europe. Digitalization, defense, decarbonization leads to a request for more mines, more energy capacity, and for the time being, we're indeed not in a political situation where the word post-growth is accepted politically. Because right now, what is important is saying, if we want the European Union to survive, if we want it to survive not only for the Europeans, but also for it to be able to develop standards and project them at an international level, we need to be able to defend the European Union. On the other hand, and I think you mentioned this in the documentary, there is one thing that is going to have a huge impact in Brussels in the next few weeks. We are lacking a sort of ecological niche in Europe. We tend to warm twice more fast than in the other countries worldwide, in Italy, south of France, Greece, and so on. There are issues with the water, with the land, and with the trading flows between continents. This is going to have an impact on inflation, and it's also going to have a disruptive impact on the economies in Southern Europe. So we're already seeing the ecological contraction that you spoke about. We're already moving faster and faster towards it here in Europe. And from the point in time when we're capable of going to Brussels with a narrative that says that security is not only defense, security starts with ecological security. So we need a rebalancing, not only at geopolitical level, but also in terms of, on the one hand, extraction and mining, and on the other, regeneration. This is absolutely vital. This pillar needs to be used to redirect the policies of the European Union and its members. They need to understand that their actions need to be reorientated on the basis of ecology, not losing sight of security and therefore serving also the economy. Now, there's a lot of reactivity right now in Brussels, but we need to look at the synergies possible between the various pillars. Defense and decarbonization, there's one point in common, which is the logistical systems of civilian transportation which are not harmonized in Europe. If we invest now in a different type of mobility, the objective of which is not only to decarbonize but also to serve the logistical needs, then we'll be able to better deal with mining, how many minerals we need, and analyze it all from a security point of view. So we need a new language in Brussels. It's not there yet, but it will come, and it'll come soon because everything's going faster and faster lately. When you look at the US and Moscow, you realize that what is happening is that geopolitics is changing on the basis of ecology and the environment. Look at Trump's discourse with regards to Greenland. They're saying we need a geopolitical reshuffling vis-à-vis China, vis-à-vis Russia, and the same goes for Europe. There are going to be new formulae to find. We need to know exactly what we need to invest in if we really want to create security, not only at international level, but also in terms of respecting social contracts that are the DNA, the socio-political DNA of the European Union.
So beyond geopolitical issues, we do get the impression today that we only have two possible paths listening to you, telling us what is happening behind the scenes. So it's either fossil fuel growth or green growth. So on the one hand, there's a carbo-fascism and fossil fuel growth. So mining interests and the far right, and then on the other hand, there's techno-solutionism. With mining not focusing on planetary limits or geoengineering, it is difficult to see a bright future between those two. But with this idea of post-growth, could we find a third way? What would it look like if... because today it's quite easy to imagine what the future will look like if we continue on with the fossil fuel growth path and the green growth path, but it's very difficult to imagine what it could be with the third way. Well, it's true, and I will repeat the words of Timothée. We know what we don't want. We don't want these industries that lead us to overconsumption, overproduction, waste, inequalities, whether it be massive electric cars or massive ICE cars. We're faced with different dynamics, and the market is not free. When we look at liberalism, the way it is promoted by some of our parties, it's liberty for the main producers. It's not liberty for the citizen. As citizens, we do not have a say in what is produced, what is consumed. We have a say on a number of things, but we cannot decide what is happening on the economy, how we work, how we produce, the direction we're going into. And this is where there are contradictions in the way the European project was presented. You're talking about competitiveness. Competitiveness, that's the word of the day. The issue is that it's a pipe dream. It's a pipe dream. We think of competition. We think that by working against one another, we will become creative. But creativity comes through cooperation. They are very cooperative societies that are very dynamic and very innovative. Then you were talking about economic missions, but we need to find priorities. I looked at the European program. There's a European program on AI. That's actually not the right name for it, because there's nothing intelligent about artificial intelligence, but that's another topic. There is that. There's a project on space, and in Europe we will have quite a number of elderly people. And I think we need to focus on them to make sure that they're happy, that they remain productive, that they can continue to take part of society. That should be a subject for innovation. We really need to think about it. Even India, it's a young country right now, but in the coming decades, it will be in the same situation as us. So there are obstacles that we want to sail around, and there are objectives that we want to reach. But I think our priorities in Europe and elsewhere should be the well-being of our citizens, and our priorities should not be those of the ruling class in the economy, techno-fascism like Musk or Exxon. They're very similar in any case. And none of them focus on the well-being of the population. The neoliberal economic project that's promoted by Musk is not egalitarian and leads to the destruction of society at large and the destruction of the planet. It is despicable, let's be honest. A project that promotes the human nature, our capacity to cooperate, to collectively make decisions, to invent, to interact, to imagine together what society could look like, to use different types of technology. That's a beautiful project. That's something interesting. I don't know where it will take us on the geopolitical side of things, but I think that's where we need to go towards. And there would be an opportunity to strike alliances with many other stakeholders everywhere else in the world, because we're all one and the same in the end. Timothée Parrique, what about this new paradigm? Concretely, what would it look like? What would the future look like if the EU were to decide to opt for post-growth? Well, that's the main issue with growth as a civilizational objective, is that there's nothing tangible behind it. We keep talking about productivity, competitiveness, and it's all based on metrics. It's basically we are counting our steps daily. It's a metric that's 100 years old. And when we look at macroeconomy, when we even invented macroeconomics in the 30s, and the way macroeconomics has been used during the two world wars, the monetary indicators were not followed anymore. They did tangible, concrete macroeconomy. So we count the population, we count raw materials. We do actual ecological macroeconomics. And when I say that, they say, well, people will not invest and we will lose investors. But no, we need to be very down to earth. We have physical budgets that are limited. We won't be able to do everything. If the rare earth materials end up in SUVs, they won't be able to end up in fighter planes. It's as simple as that. And if our priority is to produce jet fighters, then if all the rare earths are in the SUV, then we won't be able to produce them. It's the same thing with AI. If we want to develop AI and electrify all our equipment, then we won't have enough rare earth. Absolutely. And that's the whole point of degrowth. The most sustainable resource is the resource that you can afford not to use. We're talking about sustainable mining, compensation, but if we don't need to produce things, then we don't have a problem. You might call me crazy, but I might be stating the obvious here, but this is really important. We have so many objects at home, objects that we use once a year. I don't know, a drill, whatever, cooking appliance, even for the car, you know. We have this, we live in capitalism, which turbocharges our behavior, consumption behavior. Households do spend too much money, keep consuming, and we live in this subculture of private property and happiness through things. But just imagine, through social innovation, if we can share our objects. Instead of having one drill per house that we buy a new one every 2 years, we could have one per street or one per district. That will lead to mining fewer minerals. People won't have to go and buy a drill or whatever power tool every 2 years. You don't need to think about it because you know where it is, where you can go and borrow it. You can use your brain power to do something else that would be useful for society, and then even freeze your time. And that would not affect your quality of life. That's the privilege that we have here in the countries which are already rich countries, countries which have achieved economic maturity. It's just Switzerland, most European countries. These countries have the privilege of having reached maturity. So we can't afford talking about growth and say next year we won't grow, la la la. No, but the Swiss economy, if there's no growth next year, the economy will be the same as this year. So you will still have food on your plate. Growth is exponential. That means that the extra growth done each year needs to be higher and higher every year. And when we try to match finite resources to exponential metrics such as GDP, well, it becomes very obvious that at one point we will reach a ceiling. So that's a narrative that's already over.
Très rapidement, parce qu'après, j'aimerais vous questionner tous les trois sur les questions de démocratie.
Very briefly,
La parole, Olivia Lazard.
Olivia Lazard, if we imagine, let's imagine that Europe has adopted a post-growth strategy. What would that mean concretely on a geopolitical perspective? Well, under the current circumstances, if the EU were to adopt degrowth as a model, so if we would decouple from raw materials, that's actually what you're talking about in your articles, right? Yes, absolutely. So some industries wouldn't be doing too well. For example, car makers. So allow me to state first that I don't think SUVs are a good idea. I do agree that there are a lot of products and objects that are already passé. But when we look at automobile production in Germany, that's a lot of jobs which are suffering from international competition. China on the one hand, Tesla on the other. they didn't jump on the decarbonization bandwagon early enough. So if the sector collapsed, the car industry collapsed, that lots of people will lose their jobs. That's where we could come in and say, okay, we create safety nets for those people and we try to reintegrate them in other industries. However, if we import vehicles, electric vehicles, from elsewhere, BYDs, for example, from China, the data collected by those cars will not stay in Europe. Data will be sent back to China. And some colleagues at the European Council of Foreign Relations have proven that BYD cars have a recognition perimeter of about 5 to 15 meters. I'm not sure about Tesla, but as you were saying, Elon Musk is not a hero of the people who will fight for human dignity, right? At least not how we understand it here in this room. So in that context, we would lose a lot in economic policy, we would lose jobs. So it makes sense to support some industries, even though I do agree that it contradicts the logic of respecting planetary limits. So we're back in that dilemma between environmental security and planetary security. In the geopolitical game, we have superpowers, China, the US, which today are focused on dismantling the EU for many different reasons, actually. And if today we were to adopt a degrowth project, and in an ideal world, I do agree with you, cooperation would be the best possible value, but we do not live in this ideal world. The EU is not a superpower. The EU is trying to defend itself with the resources that it has, and the European project is being questioned in this new geopolitical context where the powers do not generate the peace dividends. In this context, if we do not look for the resources for growth that also include mining, urban mining, to try to find minerals in already developed economies through recycling, through improving efficiency, in that case, well, the EU will, to put it simply, will not survive. And, well, the EU is faced with a dilemma, an existential dilemma, when it comes to its peace project and its international ambitions, especially on climate. And I think these planetary limits will be included in the years to come, as they will become part of the security project of the EU. And I would love to hear what you think about this, but we'll have to see how the EU can defend itself. Once the geopolitical transformations have happened, then yes, we will have to talk about post-growth, because anyway, we are heading into a war. The question is, will we be able to solve our dilemmas and come back to collective intelligence and together stay within planetary limits and not opt for techno-solutionism? All right, so we don't know how fast we're heading into a war, but we do know that that's where we're heading. We've overshot 6 planetary limits out of 9.
de ce que vous disiez tous les trois, il y a quand même toujours cette...
We keep hearing terrifying things every day, and listening to what you've said today, we keep hearing people saying that it's not the priority, there are other fires to put out before that, but
Petite réaction de Julia Steinberger et de...
I would like to hear what you have to say about that, Julia Steinberger and Timothée Parrique.
Je crois que il y a des questions difficiles.
Well, those are difficult questions.
C'est aussi le moment de nous faire confiance à nous-mêmes.
And I think it's about time for us to trust ourselves. You know, we've kept hearing that we're too egoistic, too individualistic.
Dans cette direction, je pense qu'on est en fait tout à fait capable.
I think we're very capable to
Dans la vie de
think for ourselves. We've seen it with citizen assemblies, and we see it every day in our communities. We can do things differently, but it's true that we're going through very difficult times. I will mention two articles. The first one is an essay by John Maynard Keynes, who was behind the war planning in the 30s in the UK. He was saying that by 2030 would have multiplied our level of wealth by 4 to 8 times, so we wouldn't have to deal with the same problems. But he was saying that the time was for war economy, so they didn't have time to think about the future. And then second text, it was about a report dated 1972 on limits and growth. And the idea was to do away with GDP and use other more relevant indicators. And back then, the answer that was given to them was that now's not the time, we'll do that later. And geopolitics decides on what is going to happen in the economy. But I think that the objective of the economy is to free resources and free time. We're not hamsters in our wheels, but when we look at what's happening, we're dealing with it. We're addicted to growth, and we can never give up on it. So the same thing with the link between the increase in conflicts and ecological transition. But transition is becoming more and more difficult. It's almost as if we were playing easy mode in the 70s, and now we are hard mode. And we will have to decide on ecological limits and social requirements. But another very important point is that growth is not just about what we consume. We've seen it with the mines. If we nationalized all mines in Europe and decided it was public service, just like kindergartens, then we would lose a lot in growth. GDP could even go down if we removed extractive energies from GDP. So we can't just look at volumes, we have to look at the institutions. Growth is boosted by these productive activities that generate wealth, and the ruling class can then reinvest those profits into a new cycle of production. So we need to reduce the volume of things produced, but we also need to change the paradigm, because if we were to seize the means of production, that we could refocus the objective of production.
Je vous propose de poser vos questions maintenant. Normalement,
I suggest that now you ask your questions. We'll pass a microphone round the room to those who would like to ask their questions. We'll just be able to take a few so that we can have a short discussion, after which we'll close. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. And the shorter your question, the more effective it is, then the more people will be able to ask their questions too.
Merci pour ce débat. Je suis tout à fait d'accord avec la thématique.
Thank you so much for this discussion. I fully agree with the topic, but I'm wondering how we can raise the Swiss population's awareness, or even other people's awareness, about degrowth or the anti-capitalism. Have you got a strategy? How can we go about it? Maybe we'll take a few questions in one go. Are there any other questions?
Ah, il y a une question juste là. Bonsoir. Ça va? Ça marche. Bonsoir.
Good evening. Thank you so much.
Mon accent, je suis d'origine de l'Europe de l'Est.
As you can tell from my accent, I come from Eastern Europe. But when I heard you talking, I wondered about developing countries, because you spoke of degrowth, degrowth in wealthy countries. But how do you go about ensuring that the poorer countries, the South,
surtout dans le contexte
take the right path too, especially given the current context and all the geopolitical tensions? And this question is for you all. Thank you, says the moderator. Maybe we'll take a third question very quickly. No, no third question. This is your very last chance.
Non, c'est bon? Ah.
Bonsoir. Moi, j'avais une question par rapport à
Good evening.
justement les liens entre
My question is about the link between democracy and this change.
dans la démocratie, c'est une chose merveilleuse.
Democracy is a wonderful thing,
Difficile de
but
concevoir
it is difficult to
on va renoncer à des choses.
imagine that we'll all willingly give up
Quel est le narratif
things.
de la démocratie qui pourra
So,
permettre justement
what about democracy and how it could allow for these changes to take place without it being detrimental to some?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Timothée Parrique sur comment on vulgarise la
Maybe Timothée.
Julia Steinberger sur la démocratie.
Timothée on degrowth, and then you can distribute the other questions as you wish. Well, there were many topics that have been dealt with lately, the donut theory and many others. They're semantic tools that allow you to establish a link. Where I'm an economist. When I see the graph going up, it's called growth. When it goes down, I say it's degrowth. I've been told that I ought to speak about the growth of well-being, and I said, no, I'm a scientist, I'm an economist. I think that scientifically it's our responsibility to name things, and maybe you do need a little bit of a cold shower to become aware. The first time that you see a documentary on climate change, it's a punch in the stomach, and you need that moment of where you realize you have to create that moment. And when you have words of deconstruction like degrowth, post-extractivism, anti-capitalism, and so on. These are words for deconstruction. But then on the other hand, you need reconstruction words, eco-socialism, social and solidary economy, and so on and so forth. And now what we have to do is to establish a link between the two. What needs to be deconstructed, what needs to be reconstructed, and when the two come together, it's an alternative discourse, an alternative narrative. So it's a project and a trajectory to link the two.
Alors, je vais me permettre de répondre aux trois, mais du coup, ça va être archi rapide.
I'm going to try to answer all three, but then I'll be very brief.
La première question et la troisième question, on peut les ramener ensemble.
I think the first and the third question can be brought together. How do you communicate about this? Well, we are
De l'histoire de l'humanité et que
the generation that
nous avons absorbé une propagande
stands out.
sur la nature humaine.
We've generated extraordinary propaganda on human nature, on the fact that we're consumers and so on and so forth, and the fact that we're now talking about degrowth and deconstruction and radical change. How do we get those messages across? Then it's getting across the fact that we're not only consumers and that we need to consume less, which will create many advantages. Saying that if there's no growth, things will go badly, that's something that was created by the industries in the 1980s. They basically said, if we protect the environment, well, you're going to lose your car rather than you're going to gain something. So everything that you gain by changing the economy, everything you gain in terms of equality, emancipation, and human potential, and getting a stable planet, all of this needs to be brought together and put forth so that it becomes attractive for developing countries. On the other hand, well, that's part of my project. We have a post-growth for developing countries and the Global South, and there are all these geopolitical aspects. There are countries, obviously, that require growth, and there are countries that need freedom because they should no longer be producing for us. They need to produce for themselves and have their own economic, political, and social projects. And here in Geneva, we have the WTO, which prevents countries from doing so. And there are the tribunals, and what we can do is give freedom back, give the rest of the world an opportunity to do things for themselves. And so there are degrowth policies for countries in the south, delinking and stopping this colonial extractivism that's still going on. And maybe very quickly on how to integrate citizens in rethinking our democracy and the economic democracy. I know you published research on this recently. Yes, the democracy. Can we decide the most important things for ourselves? The neoliberal approach was maybe not the best, and what we need is economic power. We need a real democracy, and that is, do we have the right to decide what is produced, how we consume, how we get organized, what our priorities are, what our investments are, and we're capable of doing this. If we don't do it, look at who does it for us. So this is slightly revolutionary project, but I think that the borders of our democracy are not where trading starts. Anesh, thank you for your question. Thank you for being here.
Justement, comme tu l'as très bien dit, il n'y a pas de question de post-croissance, je pense, en tout cas encore dans les pays dits du Sud.
There is no post-growth to be considered for countries in the South. It's more a matter of looking at freedom and self-determination, as you mentioned, Julia, in a context in which we have many countries that are wealthy, that have a lot of minerals and metals, and they're trying to grow, but also create some independence from these huge powers, US, Russia, and so on, that act a bit as like a vacuum cleaner with regards to these resources. And then there's another dimension that I find interesting, sometimes difficult to come to grips with, but very interesting. All the countries of the South that have mining resources currently are those who are the arbitrators in a certain sense of the minerals that the other countries want to get their hands on. This means that they can decide on the investments of the countries of the North and try to orientate their growth. Now, it's a matter of knowing to what extent they change their models, their growth models, in terms of social contracts, and whether they genuinely do manage to protect the value of the minerals without having a negative environmental impact. If there is going to be extraction somewhere, there can be some offsetting. And this was briefly touched upon in the film, but it does need to be strengthened and improved. And how do we prevent mining from taking place in regions and areas that are too fragile or critical from a planetary point of view? And these are discussions on nature and finance. We have an agreement finally on international funding that will be of a new type, and so it's a matter of knowing to what extent the funding of this transition, with all its standards and economic foundations, whether those investments will be benefiting the countries in the South, and whether
entre ces fameux moyens pouvoirs qui ont les clés justement de la désescalade géopolitique entre la Chine.
Who will be controlling these very same investments? Well, we could have kept going for hours on end, but unfortunately we've reached the end of our debate. Thank you, all three of you, for being here.